I think I'll just sit here. I think this is better.
Yeah.
And good morning, everyone. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and delighted to be having this conversation. I love Cathy Ashton. I love Cathy Ashton. Confession, she is the former High Representative for Union Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, shorthand the EU's foreign minister, whose previous roles include Leader of the House of Lords and EU Trade Commissioner. Those are the previous roles. The future roles, who knows? She is, as you can see, warm, charming, experienced, smart.
See why I come here.
I think we need to clone her in every government and every NGO in the world. Other than that, I don't have a strong opinion about this. As you know, and this is the most important thing about Cathy, she's a scholar here. She is back. And we are extremely happy to have her. And this is tour 2. We're eager for tour 3. Mm-hmm. What day is that starting?
Soon.
Soon. I last saw her last week in London at a policy dinner hosted by Sir John Scarlett, who is a very close friend of ours, former head of MI6, the British CIA, and co-chair of our Global Advisory Council. He hosted a dinner, and she was, what would you think, brilliant. So today's conversation is on a broad range of topics, and you're part of it, and we started a bit late, so we'll go a bit late. But there's so much to ask you. Why don't I ask with current affairs? I was reading my New York Times, my failing New York Times, the print edition. I'm one of the lasties who actually reads the print newspaper. Raise your hand if you read it. There he is. Hey, I knew this was a highly educated audience. But there is a report in relation to Brexit that more than 150,000 Russian Twitter accounts were used to post pro-Brexit messages before the vote last summer, and that some 400 accounts have been directly tied to the Kremlin. And earlier this week, Theresa May made a very strong speech, and the British government reported that Russian hackers attacked the UK energy grid and telecommunications and media industry. So, any thoughts?
Well, it's great to be here, as I said, and it's wonderful to be with the audience. I think we are in a very interesting phase of a new kind of small W warfare, which is about the power of information and access to it. And my generation gives way to the younger generation who acquire their knowledge in completely different ways to the way I did. If you said to a young person, go get an encyclopedia, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. They live by information.
They know what Wikipedia is.
They know what Wikipedia is, exactly. But they live by information in a different way. And so it would be, in a sense, unsurprising if those who want to affect or alter or change people's viewpoint didn't attack and use that form of media. The problem for governments is we're way behind in trying to work out what and how we manage that. We do it partly because we still have pretty old-fashioned methods of counting votes. In Britain, you still have a pencil on a piece of string and you put an X by it, which my children think is hysterical. But actually, in a way, it's the safest proposition. But we don't really have a way of thinking how we're going to go forward with ensuring that we keep people safe and secure in terms of information. You have so many channels to watch. You have so many opportunities for people to invade your space with information that they claim to be fake or true, depending on your political perspective. So whatever the reality of this, and I honestly don't know how this will all turn out, we are going to have to seriously think about what we do when it comes to our democracies, in the broadest sense of that word, and how we make sure that people are getting information which is true, and at least know where the information is coming from.
Well, two comments. First of all, I often say that the problems are digital, but politicians are analog. And our solutions, I think I have some credibility here. I am a recovering politician. Our solutions are laundry lists of you can do this and you can't do that. And if you're a kid hacker, first of all, you pay no attention to that. But second of all, you can just, run circles around that kind of shopping list. Yeah. So I think we're pretty hopeless and challenged in the policy dimension, which is why the Wilson Center has cyber boot camp on Fridays for Hill staff on a bipartisan, bicameral basis. Meg King is the brilliant director of our science and technology program and runs this. And we are not only training people on how the internet works, but also what are some policy solutions that could work, not just not work.
I was going to say, the other thing is we've got to look at our education system too, because how do you work out when you read the New York Times or you read in Britain the Times or the Express or whatever, what the politics is of the print newspapers, never mind when you simply get on your Twitter accounts people feeding stuff in. We have to actually educate and train people to be able to discern what it is they're getting. Agree or not agree, political spectrum being what it is, it's not about trying to make people think one way, but it's allowing them to think properly that this is what they're receiving and this is what it means.
There are a lot of challenges, though, even on our college campuses. I don't know about yours, but there are very strong voices trying to, in my view, shut out the speech of people they disagree with. I probably disagree with the same people, but I think they have every right to speak. And as someone who grew up in the 60s, now I've disclosed my hideous old age, I thought the free speech movement was about everybody's free speech, not just about some people's free speech. And you don't learn how to discern what's true, what's not, what's moral, what's not, what's good, what's bad, unless you hear a variety of viewpoints. But drilling down on this a little bit more, the allegation in the New York Times story in the print newspaper is that the Russians were using a lot of this. And we've had the same problem here. It was the same year. And so one of the things the tech companies have proposed is an app that would show you who paid for the ad. So at least you'd know if you read something and you disagree with it or agree with it, you could go and check who paid for it. But it's not a government solution, which may be better since the tech companies seem to have more access to this information than our government does. But more seriously, is this enough of a response by Britain or by the US, given the fact that we now have pretty clear proof here, and I assume there, that the Russians meddled in our elections and possibly, for sure they influenced some voters. Whether their meddling caused the outcome or not, it seems as though they were trying to foment anger, and the populist anger in both countries drove a lot of protest voting against Remain, I would assume, and against one of the party candidates.
Yeah, I don't want to give them too much credit either for what they managed to do. I think that the issues that created in Britain the vote to leave the European Union, some of them are very deep and long-term. People have, for a long, long time, wondered what this project was about, and successive governments have not really answered that question satisfactorily. In fact, often they've blamed the European Union for things that are convenient to blame the European Union for. When I was a government minister, we used to joke, local government blames central government, we blame Brussels. It's kind of what you do in the grand scheme of things. So there's a whole set of things. But I think, first of all, we need to understand what exactly has happened. And I'm not sure from the stories so far that Britain has got to the bottom quite of everything. And then look at what this means if you accept that it's probably not the case that they changed the outcome, but they certainly influenced some people's thinking in a more broader sense, then the implications, if you project forward for our democracy, are tremendous. So it's now a case of what do governments do? And it is not about just, as you said, the list of do's and don'ts. It really is about how do you get people to understand what's happening to them, and how do you get people to be able to resist that? When you think about children and the internet, I used to do a lot of work on protecting children on the internet in all sorts of ways, particularly from predators. and a lot of legislation to do that. But the biggest thing we were able to do and tried to do was to educate kids to understand what was happening, that the person that they were talking to might not be who they say they are. And that's also the case when you've got propaganda coming to you. It may not be coming from where you think it's coming from. So what do you need to do to check that? How do you protect yourself from that?
So let's talk about the EU. I think a lot of people here don't know what the job of foreign minister to the EU is. They don't know, and I of course want to talk more about the Iran deal, but they don't know what you did, and they don't know how you view the challenges going forward to the EU. And we've certainly met your successor, Federica Mogherini, and the challenges she faces, and whether they're different from the challenges you faced.
I think they're different in one particular way, and I think Federica would agree with this, which is that I hope I handed her a service that works. When I started, there was no foreign policy service. It didn't exist. So the first job was to create it, which is 140 embassies across the world, and to create a way of working that brought member states of the European Union together as a coordinated group.
Well, how did you create it? I mean, is it a formal entity?
Yeah, it's a first institution created in 50 years in Brussels. So what it says, there's a treaty called the Lisbon Treaty, and in it, in Article 27, subsection 3, I can still remember 3 years after I've left, it says the High Representative shall be supported by European External Action Service, full stop, end of paragraph. And that was it. And that had to be translated into the creation of a diplomatic service that was European. It didn't look like the Brits or the French or the Germans or the Spanish or the Latvians or anyone else. It had to be European. So my job was to create that, but to create it, I needed the unanimous support of the 28 member states of the European Union, the unanimous support of the 28 commissioners of the European Commission, and a majority in the Parliament. That was quite tricky. But we did it. And we did it because we've created something that they could believe in and involved and engaged them in doing it. But at the same time as creating that, I also had to deal with all of the issues of foreign policy that came my way. So I once described it as rather like trying to fly a plane while putting the wings on at the same time. And when we got to low cloud and the turbulence started, that was quite fun. And it certainly had no wheels to land for quite a long time either. So I hope that what Federica's got is at least a good, solid foundation of a service. It exists. There is a logo which we drew one afternoon because I don't want to spend any money on a logo. There's a building. I designed the kitchen and the food court. It won an award.
Women can do everything.
It won an award after I'd left. I didn't get the award, but it won the award for the best food court in the institutions because they didn't have any other food courts. They didn't know what I meant. But you know what a food court is. But
So
I
then
thought
it
it would
also
be a great
was the
thing.
worst food court.
It was, yeah. Well, it's a great place. And doing all of that meant, I think, most of all, finding things in foreign policy that Europe could do that did not detract from what member states were doing, but were uniquely European, if I can put it like that. So it was the development of the soft power of Europe to address particular issues that, when you look back on it, only Europe could do, not an individual country.
So I'm still confused about what the school is, in addition to having good food and good people. Does it train people?
No, we don't. We have diplomats who come from member states. We have members of the Commission who are senior people, many of them diplomats as well, but who deal with development work, trade, who are experts in either the geopolitics or the issues that affect a particular country. So if you're the head of delegation or the ambassador to a particular nation, you will have been chosen because your field of expertise fits the bill for each of these different delegations. Some places, the emphasis will be more on trading and on the political links. In other places, we're doing a lot of development work. There'll be lots of development teams there, so you might have somebody who's got more of a development focus, because actually they're the umbrella for that. But they represent the views of the 28 nations to that country, whatever happens. And that means they have to be prepared to go and talk about all issues: trade, economic development, human rights, issues directly relevant to that particular nation, on behalf of all the other countries of the EU.
So since you left, there's another country. I just thought I'd point out that I actually paid a little bit of attention. There are now 29 countries in the EU. Am I right?
No.
Why?
28?
What is the? Why am I remembering this? It's.
Which one are you thinking of?
I'm thinking of.
Croatia. No, Croatia came in while I was there. That made the 28.
All right. Well, then I've got it wrong. Okay.
No, but you weren't far out. It only came in towards the end.
All right. But you mentioned soft power. You didn't mention hard power. We all know our friend Joe Nye from the Kennedy School, who's coined these phrases, which are now in our lexicon.
Yeah.
What about defense? Does the EU, there's been a lot of discussion in Europe on strengthening defense cooperation. 20 countries signed up to this. And I was just in NATO. I was mentioning this. Our new ambassador to NATO, Kay Bailey Hutchison, is a close friend and was in the United States Senate. NATO obviously is a defense organization in Europe. But what's the relationship between the EU and NATO, and what role does the EU as a standalone organization play in defense?
So one of the things we did when we were developing the service was try and work out what the links between the EU and NATO should be. And we set up a regular conversation between the Secretary General of NATO and my role, which my successor has taken forward, grown, developed and enhanced for sure. And that was to recognise that there's a big overlap of membership, but there are differences, and of course the functions are different. So the way I approached it was this. So we spend 200 billion euros on defence each year. We could spend it better.
Who's
Europe.
we?
Europe. We have 12 or 13, or we did when I was in office, different specifications for essentially the same kinds of equipment. Mm-hmm. And if you think about economies of scale and collaboration, you can use your money better. We did a lot of work too on research and development. So looking at different methods that countries use to train their military, or doing the training ourselves. An obvious example, training of helicopter pilots for the Afghanistan work. We did a lot of work on mid-air refueling, because in the Libya campaigns it became clear many countries in Europe did not have the capacity to do mid-air refueling because they never needed to. If you think about the shape and size of Europe, they weren't doing campaigns so far away, but then they needed to be able to. So we did a lot of training for them in that. And looking at things like improvised explosive devices, where you need to do a lot more research on the footprint and the work that can be done to establish who has made this and so on. All of those different pieces of work enhance the ability of Europe to collaborate on defence, but they also enhance NATO, because all of that information and work was also fed into NATO. Mm-hmm. So it's about the synergy between what the EU can do and what it's good at, and the capacity it has to be able to enhance our defence capabilities as NATO.
So the $200 billion, I'm thinking in terms of our president insisting that every country, every member of NATO pay 2% of its budget, and which is not achieved by many of those countries yet, although the trend is in the right direction. Is the $200 billion, does that include funds paid to NATO, or those are?
Yeah, it does.
How do you, explain your accounting.
It's always a question you hate, isn't it? It's the overall figure that if you add up the defence spending of each of the 28 countries, whether they give it to NATO, whether they use it internally, that's roughly what you get. And it may have changed. I mean, these figures are 3 years out of date, because I'm out of date in that sense. And, you know, when you look at that money, and you look at the needs and the concerns that Europe now has, as well as looking to spend more and increasing up to the 2%, which is an ambition that NATO has had for a long time, And as you rightly say, very few countries currently hit, though I think the move is very definitely in that direction. It's also that the needs for how you tackle threats are changing as well. Cyber warfare is a huge challenge for everybody. Looking at non-state actors, as we call them, is going to be a big part of how you think about your defence and security. And so finding ways that you use the money better and then enhance that money with new money, but working collaboratively with your allies has got to be a better way of achieving what you need for your people.
Well, we actually went through that in this country. We had, competitive military services, and finally in the 1980s, a law passed called Goldwater-Nichols, and we established a joint command across our military agencies, and we now source things jointly. I mean, it seems obvious now, it wasn't then, and that's what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is, and the other support systems come from the other services, and we modeled our reform of our intelligence community on the same principle, having a joint commander who is the director of national intelligence. So it makes a lot of sense to do these things. But just one last question on the EU and NATO. If Brexit ever fully occurs, Britain is still a member of NATO.
Right.
So what kind of a divorce is that if you're still partly married but you're not?
Well, I think they would differentiate massively in Britain between NATO and the European Union. They see the European Union absolutely as an economic partner, political partner, but they don't see the defence and security part of the European Union as being of the same significance as being part of NATO. I think what will be clear, whatever happens, is that Britain will remain a strong defence and security partner for NATO and also for the EU, because many of the missions that the EU has been engaged in inevitably are missions that Britain would want to be engaged in as a member state in any event. And when I was High Representative, we did a lot of agreements with other countries who participated in EU missions. Mm-hmm. That was a very common and easy thing to do. So there'll be some form of agreement. And my personal view is that that's actually going to be one of the easy parts of any divorce, because there is complete commitment from Britain to be a strong defence and security partner for its allies in Europe and its allies across the Atlantic.
So 2 final questions before we go to the audience. One is still on this subject. The U.S. is a member of NATO. The U.S. is obviously not a member of the European Union. What Brexit or no Brexit or soft Brexit or whatever, how do you see the relations between our country and the EU going forward?
I think the EU would probably feel that it's still not entirely certain where the administration wants to develop its relationship with Europe as a group of countries. I think individual nations, we've seen the visit of President Trump to Paris with President Macron. There's obviously been a number of important bilateral conversations, not least for Chancellor Merkel. But I think developing that into what the strategy or the approach is overall to Europe is still work in progress, I think is how I would define it. One of the things that I think as a consequence is that Europe is thinking more and more about the things it needs to do for itself. Mm-hmm. We go back to NATO and the 2%, the increases in thinking about increasing the level of commitment financially to NATO is in one sense an outcome of being clear that they have to take further responsibilities for themselves. And you can argue that that of itself is not a bad thing. So I think we'll see more, as next year goes on, and we see how it develops in terms of common issues, common threats, common concerns, whether there is a stronger sense of a US-European strategy than I have at the moment.
So my final question, you are forever woven into the story about this deal with Iran, which I personally favored. I think many here did. Not a perfect deal. What negotiation is perfect? But a deal that at least took one form of bad behavior by Iran off the table. Other forms of bad behavior are still on the table, but Rob Litvak, our vaunted senior vice president has said the deal was transactional, not transformational, and I think most would agree. Looking back on that, how do you see it? And looking forward, how do you see it? I mean, our own Congress has an opportunity to, I would say, blow up the deal if it chooses to. I don't see that happening. The president has decertified it, but there's a second step that may never be taken. What do you think?
Well, the deal, as Rob puts very well, is what it is. It does what it says on the can. We say tin, you say can. It doesn't try and do lots of other things that people would like to do in dealing with the relationship or lack of it with Iran. And it was never meant to. It was one purpose. The brief I had from the Security Council was to give confidence in the purely peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear program. It was etched on my heart. And that's what we did. You can have confidence. The IAEA are confident.
Right.
And that's a considerable way from where we were when we first started negotiations with Iran. I did over 4 years of negotiations, both with the Ahmadinejad government and then with the Rouhani government. And there were real concerns that we were approaching the point when it was quite conceivable that we could have seen a nuclear-armed Iran, and now we don't. And therefore, the agreement, for what it is, works. So I'm a simple soul. If something works, I don't see any point in ripping it up. I do see a lot of point in trying to negotiate or discuss or sanction or whatever you like around lots of other questions and issues, but not this one. While you focus on this one, you're not focusing on everything else that needs to be focused on. And having got the position where we know how to negotiate with them in a process with countries who are not normally in a negotiating team together, think of Russia and China, US, France, Britain, Germany, but with the EU, I was the coordinator, if you like, of the gathering. Even when we were having significant challenges with Russia over Ukraine, we kept negotiating together with Iran. So if you've got a process that sort of worked, and you've got a deal that works, and you've got a sense of how you might go forward, I don't frankly understand why we're not going forward, why we're trying to say this isn't good enough for what it is. And I understand that some people felt we should have had other things attached to it. Well, fine, but that's not what it was. I understand that some people would have preferred bits of it to be stronger. Well, that's fine, but actually it does what it says it's meant to do. So for us, or for me, I think and hope that Congress will keep this, but that should not prevent Congress or for governments from thinking what else needs now to be addressed.
Well, two observations. One is to salute your personal skill at helping to negotiate this. This was a human endeavor, didn't happen by robot, and you obviously made the sale of this very important transaction. But second is to express a little regret, which I know that the Obama administration felt. They hoped that this would change Iran's behavior in other ways, not just with respect to complying with the strict terms of the deal, which it is doing according to the IAEA. The IAEA was here about 2 weeks ago. Director Romano was here, and he's been here many times. But at any rate, I suppose one can only speculate, but did you expect there would be a happier ending, or at least a happier middle to this story than there has been?
I hoped that it would lead to moving on to the next set of issues, if you get what I mean. I hope that having got this one done, that in a sense we could move straight on. And that's not a criticism of anyone, because that's easier said than done. And of course there were lots of changes going on. I mean, throughout the negotiations we were changing governments in Europe, we were changing people all the time, and we changed government in Iran itself. So things change with new governments, but I still believe that in the end, diplomacy is what you have to use in the end try lots of other things, but in the end, it's what you have to do. And we shouldn't lose the fact that we worked closely with countries who were helpful. And I've said this many, many times, but without the United States, it could not have been done. But I would also say that of the other countries. It was not a bilateral deal. And in the course of my negotiating, there were moments I can point to where every single country made a difference to getting it done.
And all the other countries, except for the United States, or except for the President of the United States and some members of Congress, want to stay in the deal.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting. Questions? I'm going to call on Rob first, whether he wants to or not. Our resident Iran guru.
Well, thanks very much, Jane. Thanks, and welcome back, Kathy Ashton. Let me switch from Iran back to Russia, because you've spent a lot of time in Ukraine, and Russia is probing on its periphery, and there are questions about its intentions and what would be the effective collective strategy, politically, economically, even militarily. There's a debate about providing weapons to the Ukraine government. Could you give us your assessment of where we're at now with Russia, its periphery, and specifically the Ukraine crisis?
The way I've always viewed Russia's activity is what I call the wedge, which is that because you can argue it feels threatened, or because it has ambition, whichever way you look at it, it moves in a way that prevents the nation state with which it's maneuvering from operating as a nation state normally would. So Georgia cannot really operate internationally as a country. It can't join alliances, it can't do certain things because it still has Russian troops on Georgian territory. In Moldova you have Transnistria, and in Ukraine you have what's happening in the east, even if you discount Crimea. Now, if Russia would say this is because it has felt very threatened by the expansion of NATO. It's not so much the EU, it's about NATO. And that every country that joined the EU after the collapse of the Soviet Union also joined NATO. So they say, here is a track record, we see these nations moving towards you, and so on. As well as the internal disputes over territory, the sense of entitlement, or that things were not done properly, especially in Crimea. That they believe Crimea was given away when it should not have been, and so on. Whatever viewpoint you take, the reality is that the kind of cold, chilly, frozen type conflict is a handy vehicle to keep nations from moving forward in the way they might wish to, that's not in your interests, and it's not as costly in any sense as a hotter conflict might be. So, as I see it, there's going to be a continuation for some time of that approach. I think in Ukraine, part of the issue will be how the US responds to Ukraine, and how far the continuation of policy towards supporting Ukraine's independent moves will be seen to be a key factor in American foreign policy. And I think I don't know, you may well know, I don't know where that currently stands. I was in Ukraine earlier this year, and there was certainly a feeling from many of the younger people that I spoke to that they knew or felt that they would have to take a greater role and responsibility in developing their country. In other words, that they could not rely on any of us to be as consistently working with them as in the past. And we'll see whether that changes over the months to come. So that's where I think we are presently, and I don't see that that's going to change. What we may find is that there are other areas of the world we need to look at around Russia, where because things are changing, perhaps in Central Asia, there may be more activity.
Well, just to comment on that, the countries of Europe and even I think this administration are not talking about reducing sanctions on Russia for the behavior although the president pointed out the other day after a meeting with Mr. Putin that the sanctions have caused hardship in Russia. For sure they have. But Rob asked you about arming Ukrainians, and that's been a controversial issue, and most people, at least the U.S. position, has not been to do that. Do you agree that that's where that should be at this point?
About 2 years ago, there was a fantastic debate that raged between different scholars, as I recall, about whether or not arming Ukraine was going to be a successful strategy. In general, I don't see how that's going to help the people in the east of Ukraine who are confronted with a pretty awful life and the risk of spasmodic warfare breaking out. For me, it's got to be now about diplomatic solutions or trying to find a way of resolving it in a political sense. Because if you take my point about wedges and you translate physical action on the ground into political action, the political equivalent of a wedge is giving people some say in the future of where their country goes. Yep. And so the trick or the challenge or the whatever is going to be, how do you create a political system that recognises people have different viewpoints, regional government, if you like, or enables them to have a big say without that being effectively a veto on the future of the country as well.
Well, wouldn't it be wonderful if that vision happens? It surely would. Question over here? Anybody? This is the silent side? No. This man right here in the third row. Microphone is coming. Wait. I know it is. Okay. Here we go. Please identify yourself.
Thank you. Christian Fidonovsky, Georgetown University. I would like to mention something that hasn't been discussed so far, except for that unfortunate gaffe with Montenegro earlier, and that is the Balkans. So I would like to ask Baroness Ashton about the Serbia-Kosovo agreement in 2013, which you helped mediate. So has there been any progress, in your opinion, in Serbia-Kosovo talks since the agreement? And also, what are your expectations in terms of future enlargement of the Western Balkans? Thank you.
I have a real passion for the Western Balkans, and particularly for the wonderful leaders of Serbia and Kosovo who did the agreement, which was incredibly difficult for them to do. My view is that the Western Balkans belongs in the European Union, and we have to have a trajectory that gets them in. I also think Britain belongs in the European Union, but that's by the by.
Not yet.
Well, and I think it will take some years to achieve that, but Europe needs to continue to believe that that's what needs to happen. More importantly, the countries of the Western Balkans need to realise that the best hope for their own future, especially economically, is going to be to part of the European Union. And although they do in theory, there's quite a lot of work that some of them need to do to put that into practice. That's especially true in Bosnia-Herzegovina. As far as Serbia and Kosovo, I've been to both countries this year. And I still believe that there is a lot, A, that they could and should do to continue to move from first agreement to second to third to fourth. And B, in the context of that, they are going at some point to have to think about how they relate to each other, what relationship they're going to have with each other, because getting them both into the EU at one level addresses borders because you're part of the same thing. At another level, they're going to have to make some decisions about how this is going to work for the future. And I think they're capable of that.
In the back, anybody? Yes, far back on my left. Yeah.
Thanks. Ruth Bell from Wilson Center. Can you talk a little bit about how the fissures on, how the European Union is going to kind of manage the fissures on the eastern side of the Union, particularly Poland, where people seem to be, the leadership seems to be interested in getting all the benefits of membership, but doesn't really want to take a lot of the responsibilities of membership?
There is a theory that says the members of the European Union from the eastern side know that blocks that look as if they will last forever sometimes melt away. And though the EU as an entity looks extremely solid, any possible shudder about Brexit failed to materialise anywhere. Just in case, they like to elect leaders who they think fit the mould of being entirely concerned about their own nation. It's a theory. It's not my theory. The reality of the European Union is that one of its great benefits is that it demands of its members that they take on the requirements of being a good member. And that means looking at issues from freedom of the press to the democratic institutions, to the judicial system and so on. And it does have the power to try and enforce that. The problem is getting the political will strong enough to be able to do it. And one of my regrets, by the way, of my own country's decision to leave is we have a strong relationship with Poland. We have a huge Polish community, and we have strong relationships with Hungary. And I would hope, even if we do leave, that we would still be willing to work with colleagues in both those countries and beyond to try and understand the importance of making sure that they provide for their people what is an essential and vital part of being a member of the EU. We are values driven if we are nothing else.
What a wonderful answer. In the front here, second row.
Thank you so much for this discussion. I am Lori Amy, working with a foundation in Albania, and my question is a micro entry to this macro discussion. Could you talk a little bit more about what it means for the European Union to have the responsibility of economic and diplomatic policy for things like bringing the Balkan countries into a neighborhood, while at the same time things like defense are radically crucial, and the United States has a sometimes complicated role. For example, we're looking at huge amounts of money going in by Erdogan to divide a population on the one hand, Putin on the other, in Albania and the Balkans. Countering violent extremism initiatives are really important. Albania is a transit country for refugees. So these much, much larger issues of the geopolitics of divisions, which are part of how we have to think about our defense, are paradoxically split from these soft power moves of integration.
So how does the macro relate to the micro?
Exactly.
I think they're indivisible. You know, when I think about why do we want the Western Balkans in the European Union, it's also for the sake of the European Union, that you want peace and security on your borders, and you want countries to be able to use the values that you hold and the way in which you live to provide for its citizens the best possible option. It is the best option, our democratic way of life, without question. And if you don't, then you invite others who maybe have a different agenda to want to try and impose or support people in those countries who would choose something else. And countries go through cycles and changes, and governments come and go, and we know how things can very quickly change and alter in our neighbourhood. Europe should know that very well from the last few years if it knows nothing else. And therefore the complexity is in a sense a simplicity. They have to be in the European Union to keep them safe and us safe and help them to become tolerant societies, economically positive, providing for all of their people. That's what we have to do. The question is only how do we do it, how quickly can we get it to happen, and how far, because you need commitment on both sides, can that commitment be continued. But if you helicopter over the landmass, it's very obvious that these are nations who should be part of Europe, feel part of Europe in the main, and many of them want to be. And the trouble comes when they're not sure that's what we want. So it's also about sending a signal that it may not happen immediately, it's a long process. Getting in the EU is difficult and tricky and requires a lot to happen, but it's a process well worth getting involved in and completing.
But what's striking about that question and the whole issue of countries struggling to come in is that some of the countries that are in, like Poland, like Hungary, have had elections, and their governments are very different from their prior governments and more nationalistic, and populism was a big driver in how people voted. And so can the EU, whether it grows or it doesn't grow, hold together given this rise of nationalism and populism in existing countries?
Yeah, I hope I'm not wrong about this, but I'm confident really. that if you asked people in any of the EU countries, leave aside Britain, do they want to leave, and actually put it to them, they wouldn't, particularly in the East. You know, it's a contradiction. There's a lot of shouting and screaming and wanting to do some things differently, and things that in European values terms are very uninspiring to look at. But actually leaving is a very different proposition. And we saw that with some of the people involved in Brexit in Britain who wanted to translate what they had done into other countries across the European Union, and found that even in places or with political parties that you might have expected would be interested, they didn't necessarily get the reception that was positive.
We have so many questions. I just have this one quick one.
Yeah.
Immigration and the fear of people who are different and come from different places was a big driver in a lot of these populist movements across Europe, including in the Brexit vote, or most people think it was. And Angela Merkel paid a high price for initially having Germany's borders open to immigrants, something I personally applauded her for. But do you have any thoughts on that? We haven't talked about it.
I think Europe suffers from, in a way, the fact that when you bring the European leaders together, the 28 heads of state and government, they don't transform into Europe when they get through the door. They carry with them, as I call it, on their backs, all of their domestic problems and troubles. Many of them are in shaky coalitions. Some of them are hanging on to government by their fingernails. Many of them are facing an election any time now. So they arrive in trying to solve these big problems with all of that very, very much on their minds. They're all going to go off to TV studios afterwards and become domestic politicians in Brussels with their own flag behind them saying, and I told Brussels this, or I told Brussels that. It's an interesting phenomenon. What's fabulous about it is that given enough time, they usually can work out how they're going to manage a particular problem. Trouble is, time is not always in their gift. And when you get to migration levels that we saw of people desperate in many cases to get away from war or horror or poverty or whatever, you need a much bigger, longer-term strategy. And the trouble is, when it's on your doorstep, developing that is much more complicated to do. So that was the dilemma I saw, that they would get there, but they're going to get there too late for the problem that's already facing them. And you get politicians like Angela Merkel who are very crystal clear about what they think has to happen. And you get others who fear that this is going to create a dramatic change in their own nation. And you saw all of that at work in a very open way. We don't have magic solutions to problems when they come like this. What we do know is we're going to have to think of longer term solutions, which include the fact that many populations in Europe need young people to come and work, need people willing to be part of their society, and need to do it in a managed way that doesn't, for some communities, make them feel uncertain or unsure about what's happening to them.
Third row on the aisle right here.
Thank you. Mike Macetic, PBS Online NewsHour. How long do you think that the current British government can survive? And if and when it collapses, is the Labour Party capable of running the country?
There's no suggestion that the British government is going to do anything other than survive. Full stop. Next question.
All right. Over here, anybody? Can't see anyone. So in the middle, in the red jacket.
Thank you. My name's Claire Healy. I'm here with E3G. I just got back from Bonn, Germany, the climate talks. So my question is about climate change as a foreign policy issue, sort of how that plays out going forward. And specifically, before Trump made his announcement about the Paris Agreement, we came to lots of these events where we had European ambassadors talking about the quote-unquote diplomatic consequences if he did pull out. Similarly, around the Iran deal, we heard of all these diplomatic consequences. Just like to hear your thoughts on what they are, where are they, what they could be.
What do you mean by diplomatic consequences?
That's the question.
Yeah, well, what did they say? I mean,
They didn't.
They
just
didn't.
kept talking about the diplomatic consequences that would occur if Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, or if indeed he pulls out of the Iran deal. there are no further details. That's the question.
Okay, right,
What
sorry.
could they be?
I thought they'd given you some. Okay. So let me talk about the Iran deal, just because that's the one that I was involved in. I think there are three questions that, thinking about what happens on the Iran deal, need to be addressed. One is the consequences for the people you've done the deal with. So the question about whether by withdrawing or changing or doing something to alter a deal that you have, if you like, signed up to, what's the message you're sending to them about any further deals that you might need or want in the future. The second is when you do an agreement with your allies, or your allies at that moment, the P5+1, permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany, and then you say, actually, all those years of work, we now don't agree with that. What's the message you're sending to them, assuming that you might need some of them, if not all of them, in the future, to be your allies in any future agreements? What price that? And then the third diplomatic question is what message you're sending to anybody else you might need to or want to have a deal with. Is it worth doing it? The pain, as they would see it, of doing an agreement if it's then not going to be stuck to. So those for me are the three diplomatic consequences that need to be thought about.
How many people still have questions? I see 2 here, 3. We'll take those questions just all together, and then we'll wrap up.
Good morning. My name is Dean Pinellas. I was a judge in Kosovo for 2.5 years. I'd like to follow up on the young man's question of a few moments ago. In your opinion, do you believe that Serbia will ultimately have to acknowledge Kosovo's independence before gaining admission to the EU?
Let's take the other 2 questions and then answer them together. I think a few rows right there. Yes.
Thank you very much. Noah Ward from American University. My question is with regards to North Korea and with your experience working on the Iran deal, what facts or ideas or lessons that you learned while working on the Iran deal do you think can be applied to the North Korea situation, and what role does the European Union play in these sort of negotiations with North Korea? Thank you.
And finally, further back, there you are.
Jeff Taliaferro, a visiting scholar at the Wilson Center. Lady Ashdown, given the uncertainty about the JCPOA and the Trump administration, can you envision any scenario in which the other members of the P5+1 would enter into negotiations regarding Iran's support for non-state militias and terrorist organizations?
Do you mean enter into negotiations directly with Iran without the US, or what?
With the U.S.
With the US,
in conjunction
okay.
with
Got you, yeah, okay. Should I answer that?
Sure.
Kosovo, eventually they have to reach an agreement about what they do on Kosovo as an existing country. It exists, it's there, it's not going to go backwards. There's a lot they can do to finesse how they do that. One of the things we learned in the Kosovo-Serbia agreements was that you can find ways of doing things that give you the results you want, but in a way that supports a little bit of fudging en route. So my example is always the phone number for Kosovo, which is for Kosovo an international dialing number as a nation state. But if you dial it from Serbia, it's a local call. Suited the Kosovars because they make a lot of phone calls in that direction. Honour is served on both sides, if you see what I mean. But yeah, ultimately they're going to have to sort that out. And that's where I think they need to go now, is to start thinking about how to do that. The EU does not ask them to recognise, because the EU as an institution does not recognise nations. And there are 5 members of the EU that do not recognise Kosovo. So it was never a requirement from the EU. But I think in the end, they need to work this border out and this idea out of who they are in order that they can move forward. How they choose to do that, I think I would put a lot of emphasis on them finding a solution rather than us imposing a solution on them. Okay. On North Korea and whether there are things we can learn from that, definitely. In the course of the Iran negotiations, North Korea was quite interested in what we were doing because they could see, not necessarily this is what they would want, but they were just interested to see how it was all managed and how the relationships were managed. And how the outcomes were seen to be outcomes that could be sold in each country at the same time, which is not always an easy thing to pull off. So I think there are things that we can take from that. But as I said before, diplomatically, if you then don't stick to that, or you say, actually, we want to move away from that, I think that sends a different message to North Korea. And thirdly, do I think the others of the P5+1 would join in with the US in discussing other issues? Well, I've always assumed that's what we would do. That there, as I said, once this deal was done, there are plenty of other issues to be discussed and resolved. It may be a different group of countries. It may be a different group of negotiators, because some issues have direct implications for the region, for the Gulf, for others, where it would be wholly inappropriate for it to be the same team, as it were. On the other hand, this came from the Security Council itself, so you can argue a Security Council remit allows you to talk to them as a Security Council team rather than as a group of nations. So huge opportunities, but only if there's a sense that this is a team going forward that sticks to the agreements it's made.
So we have had a lot of depressing panels at the Wilson Center lately. This is a fairly optimistic conversation, or at least the fabulous woman to my left is fairly optimistic. I started by saying she is warm, charming, smart, and experienced. Raise your hand if you agree with me. Aha. Thank you, Lady Ashton, for joining us for an hour.
Thank you.